The Stranger at the Creek. The late summer sun beat down on the cracked earth of New Mexico territory, its rays painting everything in golden dust. Eleanor Whitaker stood on the edge of her modest homestead, her faded bonnet shielding her eyes as she scanned the horizon. Nothing but brush, dry wind, and a wide silence that swallowed sound. It had been 5 years since her husband died, leaving her alone with a plot of land, a stubborn mule, and a resilience carved out of hard winters and lonelier summers. She was headed to the creek, a half-mile walk from her home, when she first saw him. At first, she thought it was a fallen tree limb caught in the reeds. But as she moved closer, the shape took form. A man, slumped against a rock, his skin dark with blood and dirt, his chest barely rising. She froze. He was Navajo. Her heart pounded so loud she could hear it in her ears. Stories had traveled through every campfire and Sunday meeting. Raids, thefts, ambushes. Neighbors warned her that kindness could cost a settler her life. But Eleanor did not move. The man's breathing was shallow. One arm was twisted awkwardly, and a gash ran down his side. His eyes were closed, but his fingers twitched slightly, still alive. Eleanor looked back toward her homestead. No one saw her. No one ever did. She stepped forward. Kneeling beside him, she uncorked her water skin and slowly tilted it to his lips. At first, the man didn't react. Then he coughed, his throat jerking. Water dribbled down his chin. His eyes fluttered open, hazel brown and alert even through the haze. He looked at her, not with fear, not even with suspicion, just the quiet weariness of a man who had seen too much. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered, unsure if he understood. He said nothing. His gaze drifted to the sky. Gently, she ripped a strip from her petticoat and pressed it to the wound on his side. The blood was dark and sticky, the kind that meant danger if left untreated. Eleanor knew little about medicine, but she had mended enough livestock and pulled enough thorns from wild dogs to recognize infection. She made her decision quickly. He was too heavy to carry, but she could bring supplies. "Stay here," she said, knowing he had no choice. Back at her cabin, she gathered water, bread, a small tin of honey, and her sewing kit. As she passed the rifle mounted by the door, her hand hovered over it. Then she moved past it. If he had wanted to kill her, he would have done it already. She returned to find him trying to sit up. The attempt failed. He collapsed back with a grunt. "You're going to tear your wound wider," she muttered, kneeling again. As she cleaned the gash, the man winced but made no sound. She threaded a needle with trembling hands and stitched the wound closed with care, whispering apologies with each pierce of skin. It wasn't until she was wrapping the wound with another torn sheet that she noticed something strange. Tattoos along his shoulder. Symbols. Lines. A warrior's marks, perhaps. Still, he remained silent. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Her heart beat fast with guilt and uncertainty. What if he died? What if someone saw her helping him? What if his tribe thought she had captured or harmed him? And yet, part of her was not afraid. By dawn, she returned with a blanket, a boiled potato, and a wooden bowl of warm milk. The man was awake this time. He didn't flinch when she approached. He simply stared at her, unmoving, accepting the food with slow hands. She noticed how he ate carefully, chewing each bite as if tasting more than just food. "You have a name?" she asked softly. He looked at her, then shook his head once. "Or you won't tell me," she guessed. "That's fine." She didn't ask again. Over the next 2 days, Eleanor came and went. She moved like a ghost across her land, always looking over her shoulder. The man, she began calling him the stranger in her mind, spoke no words. But he watched her with quiet intensity. Once, she found him trying to bandage his own arm. Another time, he tried to return the bread she gave him, pressing it into her hand, as if refusing charity. "You need this more than I do," she said firmly. "I've got plenty." That was a lie. She had enough food for maybe another month. But it was a risk she was willing to take. Something about the stranger called to her, not in a romantic way, but in a deeply human way. She saw in him the same weariness she saw in her mirror each morning. Two souls beaten down by the world in different ways. On the third day, he was gone. Eleanor stood by the creek, clutching the blanket she had brought. His place was empty. The stones he had rested on were still dark with dried blood. But there was no sign of struggle. No drag marks. Just gone. A whisper of wind swept through the reeds. She stared at the empty space for a long time, feeling a strange ache settle in her chest. Not fear, not sadness, something unnameable. She turned and walked home. The next morning began like any other. The rooster crowed. The wind carried the smell of juniper. Eleanor fed the mule, boiled coffee, and sat on her porch with a worn journal in hand. She never wrote in it anymore, just held it, as if the act kept her grounded. Then she heard the sound. Hooves. Not one, not two, dozens. She stood slowly. The coffee mug slipped from her hand and shattered. Over the rise, they came, Navajo warriors on horseback, silent, unmoving, their bodies painted, weapons sheathed, expressions unreadable. They encircled her property like shadows rising from the earth, forming a ring so precise it looked rehearsed. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She backed up until her heels hit the door. Every story she'd ever heard rushed back. Vengeance for trespassers, raids for livestock, retribution for even small slights. The air was still. No one moved. Then, one rider dismounted. He walked forward, each step deliberate. Eleanor's heart pounded. She recognized him, not from before, but through the resemblance. The man she had helped had the same eyes. This was his father, a chief. He stopped a few paces away. Eleanor didn't speak. She couldn't. She simply waited. He raised one hand. Behind him, the warriors lowered their weapons. The chief reached into his robe and pulled something out, a beaded bracelet. He stepped closer and gently placed it on the porch railing. Then, he looked at her with something close to solemnity, nodded once, and returned to his horse. Moments later, the warriors turned in unison and rode away. Eleanor stood alone, heart still hammering, staring at the bracelet. And for the first time in a very long time, she smiled. A warrior's debt. Eleanor sat on the edge of her porch long after the dust settled and the hoofbeats vanished into the hills. The bracelet they left shimmered faintly in the morning sun, its beads made of turquoise and bone, threaded with care and meaning she did not understand. Her fingers hovered above it, hesitant to touch something that felt sacred. Was it a warning? A token of gratitude? A claim? The silence returned, as vast as the land around her. That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. The vision of the warriors surrounding her home played over in her mind. She had seen men ride into town for blood and vengeance before, but not like this. There was no anger in their eyes, only silence, weight, and intention. The following morning, as the sun climbed over the horizon, Eleanor returned to the porch to find something she hadn't expected. Fresh herbs laid on the railing beside the bracelet. Wild sage, yarrow, and what looked like healing root. Someone had been there again. She looked out across the land. No movement, no riders, no print she could find. Over the next few days, the visits continued. One morning, a pouch of dried meat. Another day, a carved wooden figure of a woman holding a bowl. Then a blanket, thicker and warmer than anything she owned. No one ever knocked. No one said a word. But every offering came with the same message. You're seen. You are not forgotten. Then, one morning, she heard a knock. It startled her more than the entire war party had. She opened the door slowly. Standing on her porch was a Navajo woman, older than Eleanor, with silver strands braided into her black hair. Her face was lined with time and sun, but her posture was straight and proud. Behind her, at a respectful distance, stood two men. One of them Eleanor recognized immediately, the stranger from the creek. He was no longer injured. Dressed in full regalia, with beads across his chest and feathers at his shoulders, he stood tall. His gaze met hers, calm and steady. The woman stepped forward and spoke in slow, careful English. My name is Tanaba. I am his mother. She gestured toward the man behind her. He is Yaji. He would not speak before. Now he wants to thank you. Eleanor's mouth opened, then closed again. Emotions tangled in her chest. I didn't do it for thanks. Tanaba nodded. We know. That is why it matters. She reached in her robe and pulled out a folded piece of deerskin. A letter. For you. Eleanor accepted it with trembling hands. It was stitched at the edge and sealed with a thin strip of sinew. When she opened it, she found not words, but a painting. A careful drawing in natural dyes. A woman kneeling by a creek, holding water to a fallen warrior. Behind her, the sun rose. Eleanor swallowed hard. She looked up at Yaji, who gave a solemn nod. I didn't even know who he was, she said softly. I just saw a man who needed help. Tanaba placed a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. That is what makes it powerful. Yaji stepped forward then, speaking for the first time. His voice was deep and even. You saved me. I was being hunted. Soldiers chased us across the mountains. I was left behind. Eleanor glanced down at the scar on his side, just barely visible beneath his tunic. If not for you, he continued, I would have fed the coyotes. There was no poetry in the way he spoke. Just truth, raw and simple. I'm just one woman, she said. Yaji looked at her, then around the land. One woman with more courage than a regiment. The tension in Eleanor's chest loosened, and for the first time in days, she laughed. It wasn't loud or forced. It was real, soft, the kind that came after fear had passed. Come inside, she said. I have coffee. That afternoon, her kitchen, so long silent, filled with conversation. Tanaba spoke of the land, of the winds and spirits, of the mountains that remembered and the valleys that listened. Eleanor shared stories of growing up in Virginia, of losing her husband to fever, of learning to live alone. And Yaji listened. He spoke little, but when he did, his words landed with weight. He told her about the scouting mission gone wrong, the ambush near the canyon, the pain of crawling 3 days with a shattered rib. He didn't speak of revenge. He didn't speak of hate. Just survival. I owe you a debt, he said as the sky turned orange. You owe me nothing, Eleanor replied. We're just people. He looked at her, and for the first time, smiled. The visits continued. Eleanor found herself drawn into a world she had never dared approach. Sometimes, Yaji and Tanaba came alone. Sometimes they brought others. They spoke of stars, seasons, and stories passed down through generations. They taught her how to find water in dry land, how to spot which plants healed and which harmed. In return, she taught them how to make cornbread and stitch fabric without losing thread tension. She even taught Yaji how to write his name in English, slow and awkward at first, but by the third attempt, it looked nearly perfect. The town, of course, noticed. One day, Sheriff Malcolm rode up to her homestead. His horse kicked up dust as he dismounted, face drawn with suspicion. Eleanor, he said, tipping his hat with forced politeness. Heard some news. She wiped her hands on her apron. What kind? That you're keeping company with Injuns. She met his gaze without flinching. They have names, Malcolm, and I don't keep anyone. We share bread. Stories. That's all. He spat in the dirt. Folks are nervous. You start making friends like that, and soon they'll think they can take land, cattle, women. They haven't taken a thing from me, she said, voice cold. In fact, they've given more than anyone in town ever has. The sheriff studied her for a long moment, then mounted up again. You're going to get hurt, Eleanor. Don't say I didn't warn you. But she wasn't afraid anymore. That winter was the harshest in a decade. Snow came early and stayed long, blanketing the hills in thick silence. The mule died in January, and Eleanor feared she wouldn't make it through February. But she was never alone. Yaji came often, bringing smoked meat and firewood. Tanaba brought herbs for tea and thick furs sewn with love. Even the children of the tribe came, laughing, dancing, bringing joy to a house that had once echoed only with loneliness. On one bitter night, Eleanor fell ill, fever, cough, unable to rise from her bed. She woke to find Tanaba sitting beside her, spooning broth into her mouth. Yaji stood watch by the fire, keeping it fed. They stayed for 3 days. When she recovered, she wept, not from sickness, but from the realization that she had family now, just not one made by blood. Spring arrived like a long-held breath, finally released. One morning, Eleanor walked to the creek again. It looked different now. No longer the sight of a near death, but of a beginning. She knelt beside the water and dipped her hands in, feeling the cold rush over her fingers. Behind her, soft footsteps. Yaji, you always show up when I'm here, she said without turning. He knelt beside her. This is where I was reborn. They sat in silence, listening to the birds, the wind in the grass. I'm leaving soon, he said at last. Her heart tightened. Where to? A mission south. We've made peace with some of the other tribes. But it needs walking. She nodded slowly. Will you come back? He looked at her. Always. She turned to face him. You don't owe me anymore. I know, he said. But I owe the land. And the land gave me you.